A tomato plant in the corner of a backyard garden, leaves curling brittle at the edges, the soil packed hard as fired clay, despite 3 growing seasons of bagged fertilizer poured carefully into the row. Most people, watching this happen, walk to the garden centre on a Saturday morning, lift a heavier bag off the shelf, and pour a stronger dose into the same exhausted ground. But the soil scientists who study why ancient farmers built earth that still grows food 2,000 years later have found something that changes everything. In almost every case, the dying garden is not starved. It is simply addicted, hooked on a synthetic dose that has burned out the living network underneath. Within 1 growing season, with 5 recipes that cost almost nothing and require no lab and no lifting heavier than a kitchen pot, that ground can come back. 5 of them, to be exact. Recipes archaeologists have traced through the Amazon and the Roman fields and the Chinese paddies, that village elders still speak of in the Hebrides and the Andes, that the synthetic fertilizer industry spent a century convincing the home gardener to forget. There is no patent on a handful of charcoal. This is the story of those 5. What each one does, why each one works faster than a £50 bag from the garden centre, and the mistake nearly every backyard gardener makes the first time the recipe touches soil. The first recipe begins in the Amazon. Terra preta, the dark earth. How does a patch of jungle soil, abandoned by its keepers more than 500 years ago, still outproduce the cleared field beside it by a factor of 3? How does a soil keep working when no one is feeding it? The answer is charcoal. Broken small, mixed with kitchen waste, buried slow. Inside that buried charcoal sit thousands of tiny pores, a structure called aromatic carbon, a lattice of stable carbon rings that does not break down under rain or root acid for centuries. Bound inside that lattice, calcium phosphate, ammonium nitrogen, soluble potassium, and a colony of slow-feeding microbes that the soil scientists call the charcoal microbiome. That aromatic carbon is the reason a sample of terra preta pulled from the jungle floor still tests at twice the cation exchange capacity of the surrounding clay, the soil's measured ability to hold onto a nutrient instead of letting it wash away. The way it works inside the soil is closer to a sourdough starter than a fertilizer. The charcoal does not feed the plant directly. It houses the microbes that feed the plant, a slow population of bacteria and fungi that pull loose nitrogen from rain and old leaves and hand it to the root over months instead of dumping it in a single week. The plant draws on a savings account, not a Friday paycheck. Now here is the mistake nearly every backyard gardener makes. They buy a bag of lump charcoal, crush it, stir it straight into the bed. The garden gets worse, not better. Raw charcoal is a dry sponge. It pulls nitrogen out of the soil before it gives anything back. The Amazonian farmers knew this. They charged the charcoal first, mixing it with kitchen scraps and aged manure for a few weeks, letting the pores fill before the soil ever saw it. Charged charcoal does the opposite. It arrives in the soil already loaded, every pore packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, microbes, moisture, and it begins releasing slowly the moment a root reaches it. One application can hold for a generation. The Amazonian patches still hold, 600 years on, with no one tending them. The recipe asks for hardwood charcoal broken to the size of a kernel of corn. 1 part charcoal, 2 parts kitchen scraps and finished compost, mixed in a covered bucket and left to sit for 2 to 3 weeks before it ever touches the bed. No turning, no lifting. The sign that the charge has taken is unmistakable. The mixture darkens to the colour of wet coffee grounds and gives off a faint smell of forest floor after rain. Not sweet, not sour, just the old, quiet smell of woodland soil. If it smells sharp or sour, it needs another week. Once worked into the bed, a charged charcoal application begins releasing nitrogen within a week, and the first measurable plant response, deeper green leaf, thicker stem, shows up inside 3 to 4 weeks. By the second growing season, the bed holds water 3 days longer between rains. By the third, the gardener notices something stranger. The bed needs less compost than it used to. not more. The charcoal is doing the work, feeding the microbes, holding the nutrients, building a soil that will still be working long after the gardener has stopped tending it. And there is a bonus the bag of fertilizer cannot match. The charcoal locks carbon into the ground for centuries. A handful of charged charcoal in a backyard bed does, in miniature, what a forest does. It pulls carbon from the air and buries it where the rain cannot rinse it out. The gardener who has watched 3 seasons of bagged fertilizer fail can do this on a Saturday afternoon and watch the bed come back by autumn. There is a reason the synthetic fertilizer industry has never put terra preta in a £50 bag at the garden centre. There is no money in it. A handful of charged charcoal sells for the price of a bag of briquettes from a hardware store, and it lasts 600 years. The bagged fertilizer business model is built on coming back next spring, and the spring after that, and the spring after that. The Amazonian recipe ends that loop. But the next recipe does not bury its work in the bed and walk away. It builds something on the surface, in a heap, in the open air. And what it produced was the engine of an empire that fed 60 million mouths from one continent for 400 years. The second recipe is the heap, what the Romans called stercus. How did a single farm in the Italian countryside, with no machinery and no chemistry beyond what the kitchen produced, hold its yield for 400 years on the same hectare? How did the Romans grow the same wheat on the same soil for 16 generations without exhausting it? The answer was the heap behind the barn. Inside that heap, given enough time, the kitchen and the barn produced 2 compounds the Roman farmer could not name but could see in the dark of the finished pile: humic acid and fulvic acid. The first builds the structure of soil. The second carries nutrients into the root. Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella, writing De Re Rustica in the 1st century after Christ, gave the Roman heap its formal recipe: layered animal manure, layered crop residue, a sprinkling of wood ash, water, thyme, and the patience to leave it largely alone. What happens inside that heap is closer to yeast in bread dough than to a chemical reaction. Bacteria heat the pile from within, breaking down the rough material. Fungi follow, weaving white threads through the dark mass. The temperature climbs to the warmth of a bath, then drops, then climbs. Months pass. The heap sinks. What comes out is not manure. It is a black, crumbling soil that smells like the floor of an old forest. The mistake the modern gardener makes runs to one of 2 extremes. The first is turning the pile every weekend with a pitchfork. That kills the slow anaerobic phase Columella relied on and burns half the nitrogen into the air. The second is never turning at all. The pile slumps into a sour, oxygen-starved sludge that smells like a barn floor in summer. The Roman recipe asks for 1 or 2 long, slow turns across a season. Not weekly labour, not neglect. Done right, the heap turns into a self-regulating engine. The microbes manage the heat. The fungi manage the structure. The gardener turns it once when the steam dies down, and turns it again before frost. Everything else happens in the dark, on its own time. The 4 months of waiting do work the gardener cannot do with a shovel. The recipe is plain. 1 part fresh animal manure, chicken, rabbit, sheep, anything from a backyard coop. 3 parts dry crop residue or fallen leaves, a generous handful of wood ash for every wheelbarrow, layered in a heap roughly the size of a kitchen table. The sign of finished compost is the same in Lazio in the year 60 and in a backyard in 2026. The heap has stopped steaming, the original material is no longer recognizable, and the dark crumb falls through the fingers like crumbled black sponge cake. There is no manure smell, only the smell of forest floor. An inch of finished stercus, top-dressed onto a tired bed, shows in the next planting. Beans that hold green into August heat. Tomato leaves that broaden and deepen. Lettuce that does not bolt at the first warm week. The Roman farmer who built the heap behind the barn was building 2 things at the same time. He was feeding next year's wheat. He was also building a soil his grandchildren would inherit. The bag of synthetic fertilizer feeds 1 season. The heap behind the barn feeds a lineage. There is a hidden detail in Columella's recipe almost everyone overlooks today: the wood ash. A sprinkling of ash for every wheelbarrow corrects the acidity of the manure, supplies potassium, and helps the heap finish sweet rather than sour. Most modern compost guides leave it out. The Roman farmer would not have. The gardener who has thrown out 3 years of failed compost can build the Roman heap once and watch it work the way it has worked for 2,000 years. There is a quiet reason the bagged compost aisle at the garden centre sells what it sells. Most of what is in those bags is screened bark mulch, dyed dark and labelled as compost. The actual humic and fulvic acids, the compounds the Roman farmer produced for the cost of yard waste and chicken bedding, are sold separately, in 8-ounce bottles, for $30 apiece. The heap behind the barn produced both for free. The Roman heap converts what the farm already produces. But the next recipe takes what the household produces, what every modern country flushes into a treatment plant and burns natural gas to replace, and turns it into the soil that fed China for 40 centuries. The third recipe is the closed circle: Chinese night soil and mud slurry. How did the rice paddies of southern China feed the same population on the same patch of ground for 40 centuries, 4,000 years, without exhausting the soil, without trucking in fertilizer, without ever once buying a bag of anything? They returned to the soil, every season, what the soil had given them. Inside the aged slurry sat the 3 nutrients the modern fertilizer bag still labels in big numbers on the front: ammonium nitrogen, soluble phosphorus, soluble potassium. But in a balance no factory can match, carried in a microbial broth that delivers them at the speed the root can absorb them. F.H. King, the United States Department of Agriculture's chief of soils, travelled to China in 1909 and came home stunned. His book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, published in 1911, documented the closed-loop nutrient cycle that had kept Chinese soil productive for 40 generations of generations. Think of soil fertility as a savings account. The plant withdraws nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. The harvest carries those nutrients off the field, into the kitchen, into the body, eventually into the toilet. Modern agriculture treats that as the end of the line. The Chinese farmer treated it as a deposit waiting to be made. The waste was collected, aged in covered pits for weeks until pathogens died and the smell mellowed, and returned to the paddy. The account never closed. The mistake, and the reason most modern gardeners will not touch this recipe, is the smell and the fear. Both are solved the same way. Fresh waste is dangerous. Aged waste is not. 6 weeks in a covered pit, sealed with straw and clay, and the temperature, the acid of the slow ferment and the passage of time, kill the pathogens, sprout the weed seeds and starve them, and drop the smell to a dark, earthy note that fades within minutes of application. No chemistry, no gloves. What comes out of the aged pit is not waste. It is nitrogen and phosphorus already digested by microbes, ready for the root to take in days, not weeks. Diluted 1 part slurry to 10 parts water, poured at the base of the plant, it works the way no granular fertilizer can, at the speed of life, not chemistry. The recipe is a covered pit, lined with straw, with a tight wooden lid. Into it goes household and animal waste, kitchen scraps, pond mud or any heavy clay, and water. It is sealed and left for 6 to 8 weeks in warm weather, longer in cold. It is not turned. It is not stirred. The sign that the slurry is ready is in the colour and the smell. The pit liquid has deepened to the colour of strong black tea. The sharp ammonia smell of the first week is gone. What remains is the cool, dark, faintly sweet smell of pond bottom in autumn. That is the signal to dilute and apply. Applied at the base of a hungry plant, corn, squash, leafy greens that need nitrogen fast, the response shows within 5 to 7 days. Leaves deepen, new growth pushes out, the plant has eaten. The Chinese farmer who used this recipe was not buying anything. The household produced the fertilizer that fed the household. 40 centuries of food came out of soil that never once received a bag of anything. 40 centuries of children grew up on rice grown in fields whose nutrient account was always in balance, because nothing the family ate was ever truly thrown away. The pond mud in the recipe is not filler. It carries fine clay particles that bind to ammonium nitrogen and stop it from gassing off into the air. It carries trace minerals leached down from the surrounding land. The slurry is not just fertilizer, it is the watershed returning to the field. The gardener who has watched a chemical-fed bed go yellow in midsummer can build this pit once and feed the same patch for 50 years. Soil that is fed from the household never goes hungry. And here is what the modern fertilizer industry will not advertise. Every flush from every household in the developed world carries nitrogen and phosphorus the soil could use, sent instead to a treatment plant, where it is broken down and discharged to a river or an ocean. The Haber-Bosch process, the industrial reaction that produces synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, burns roughly 2% of the world's natural gas every year to manufacture a replacement for what the developed world flushes away. The Chinese farmer closed the loop with one ingredient, but the next recipe is a blend. 3 nutrients, 3 sources, 3 Andean traditions, combined into a single application that can revive thin mountain soil where almost nothing else will grow. The 4th recipe climbs into the high Andes. Guano and camelid manure, blended. How did the people of the Andean highlands grow potatoes and quinoa at 12,000 feet, on thin soil scraped from rock, in air too cold and dry for the rich black loam of the lowlands? How did terraces cut into a mountain feed an empire? They blended 3 things, never just one. The first ingredient was seabird guano, hauled by foot up from the coast. Inside it, uric acid, ammonium phosphate, calcium urate, concentrated nitrogen and phosphorus, produced by birds that ate fish for generations on rocky islands offshore. Pre-Columbian records describe Inca law protecting the guano islands as state property. Disturbing a nesting colony carried severe penalty. The fertilizer was that valuable. Guano works fast. The nitrogen in uric acid is already partly mineralized, ready for the root to take within 2 weeks of application. But used alone, it burns young roots. Too much soluble nitrogen too quickly, and the plant scorches. The mistake the modern gardener makes is treating guano like the bag of nitrogen fertilizer it resembles. Pour it on, scorch the seedling, blame the plant. The Andean farmer never used guano alone. It was always the first of 3. Cut with manure and ash, guano becomes a slow burn. The nitrogen still arrives, it just arrives gentle. The second ingredient was camelid dung, llama and alpaca, dropped in tidy piles at communal middens. Lower nitrogen than cow manure, but cleaner. Camelid digestion ferments more thoroughly than cattle digestion, and the dung emerges nearly free of viable weed seeds. Andean farmers used it without aging, straight from the midden into the soil, with no risk of weed contamination, no risk of nitrogen burn. It feeds slow. The nitrogen and phosphorus arrive over months, not weeks, building soil rather than spiking it. Combined with guano, the 2 cover the season. Guano for the fast push, dung for the long hold. The third ingredient was wood ash from the cooking fire. Inside it, potassium carbonate, calcium, trace magnesium, and an alkaline correction for the acidity the manure leaves behind. The same kitchen fire that cooked the meal produced the 3rd leg of the soil recipe. Nothing was bought, nothing was discarded. Together, the 3 cover the deficiency triangle of thin mountain soil. Guano supplies the nitrogen and phosphorus the rock cannot. Dung supplies the slow organic matter. Ash supplies the potassium and corrects the pH. Each one alone fails. The blend works. The recipe is the simplest in the entire tradition. 1 handful of seabird guano, 5 handfuls of dry camelid or any clean composted manure, 1 handful of wood ash, mixed in a bucket, sprinkled around the base of the plant at the rate of 2 handfuls per square foot. No grams, no grains, handfuls. The blended mix has a faint clay and dust smell, not pungent. Treated soil darkens within hours of watering in, and a fistful squeezed in the palm holds together rather than falling apart. First plant response shows in 2 to 3 weeks. Deeper leaf colour, sturdier stem, the unmistakable look of a plant that has finally found what it was missing. By the end of the season, potato hills throw 4 tubers where 2 used to grow. Tomato plants set fruit clear into October. The thin patch of ground at the back of the garden, the one that nothing took to last year, holds a stand of green that does not flag in the August heat. Now here is a point where much of the modern gardening advice is simply wrong, and it is worth pausing on. The popular online recipes for natural fertilizer have turned what was once a kitchen practice into a chemistry experiment. They demand exact grams of zinc sulfate, precise milliliters of pH-adjusting acid, protective gloves, sodium hydroxide, lab scales. None of that is in the Andean recipe. None of it is in any pre-industrial fertilizer recipe. The handful is the unit. The bucket is the vessel. If the soil is acidic, more ash. If the plant is yellow, more guano. The instinct of the gardener replaces the readout of the meter, and the soil responds the same way it has responded for 1,000 years. And there is a clinical eye worth developing. A yellow leaf is not always nitrogen deficiency. It can be nitrogen deficiency. The leaf yellows from the older leaves first. It can be iron lockout, common in soil that has been over-limed. The new growth yellows while the old leaves stay green. It can be root rot from a wet bed that does not drain. The Andean blend addresses the first 2. The third is solved by building the soil itself, which the blend does, season by season. The gardener who has tried bag after bag of single nutrient fertilizer can mix this blend on a kitchen counter and watch the thin bed at the back of the garden finally take. And here is the part the bag at the garden centre cannot do. The Andean blend is a composite, 5 or more nutrients, mineral and organic, fast and slow, working together. The synthetic fertilizer industry strips that recipe down to 3 numbers on a bag, N, P, K, and sells the trace minerals separately in foil packets at $15 an ounce. The Andean farmer never separated them. The kitchen and the coast and the cooking fire produced them already balanced. But the blend is still a recipe of ingredients carried in by hand. The 5th and final recipe is older than all of them, older than guano hauled up the mountain, older than the heap behind the Roman barn, and it asks the gardener only to walk to the shore. The 5th recipe is older than Rome, marling with seaweed. How did the Celts of pre-Roman Britain, the crofters of the Hebrides, the farmers of the Cornish coast, hold barley and oat fields in production for 2,000 years on soil that, by every modern metric, should have failed within a generation? They tilled the field with what the sea brought in. Inside that recipe sat 2 ingredients no garden centre sells together. Marl, a soft clay rich in calcium carbonate, corrects soil acidity and supplies the calcium plants need to build cell walls. Seaweed, washed up after a storm, carries alginic acid, mannitol, cytokinins that signal root growth, and a trace mineral profile, boron, zinc, magnesium, iodine, that no inland soil can produce on its own. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History in the year 77, almost 2,000 years ago, described how the Britons spread chalk and marl onto their fields, a practice he called the marling of the soil. He wrote that one application held a field for 80 years. What the marling actually does, by the modern measure, is correct the slow drift of soil toward acidity. Rain is acidic. Decomposing leaves are acidic. The roots themselves push acid into the soil to dissolve nutrients. Year after year, the soil sours. A sour soil locks up phosphorus, blocks calcium uptake, and starves the plant even when fertilizer is poured on. The marl, slow released over a winter, lifts the pH back to the range where the soil works. The mistake the modern gardener makes is treating the seaweed as the whole recipe. Seaweed alone is impressive. The trace minerals, the cytokinins, the rapid green response in 3 weeks. But without the marling underneath, the soil sours again the next year, The seaweed's gift washes through, and the gardener wonders why the second season did not match the first. The Hebridean crofters never made that mistake. The marl came first, the seaweed came after. Together, the two cover what no industrial fertilizer covers. The marl resets the chemistry of the soil. The seaweed delivers the trace minerals and the hormonal signals. The plant has both the room and the materials to grow. The combination is the reason barley fields on the Atlantic coast fed Iron Age communities for 2,000 years. The recipe is the slowest of the five. In autumn, after the harvest, the gardener spreads marl, or, in its place, crushed oyster shell, chalk or powdered limestone, at roughly 1 wheelbarrow per 10 square paces. Over the marl goes seaweed, fresh from the shore, a generous handful per pace. The whole bed is turned in lightly and left for the winter rain to do the work. The signs come in their own time. The cool, briny smell of seaweed fades within 3 days. The marl works invisibly through the winter. By spring, the first signal is the earthworms. They return to a bed that has been sour for years, and the gardener turns a spade and finds them, fat and red, working the soil that was almost dead the autumn before. The seaweed shows fast, 3 to 6 weeks of visible green push. The marl is slower. Its work spreads over a full season, but it lasts. Pliny's 80-year claim was not far wrong. By the second growing season, the bed holds a stand of barley or beans that does not flag in heat. By the third, an apple tree planted in the same corrected ground pushes roots through soil that stays sweet and trace mineral rich for decades. Orchards established on marled and seaweeded ground in the Hebrides still bear after generations. The investment of one autumn afternoon outlives the gardener. There is a hidden gift in the seaweed that even the Hebridean crofters did not know they were giving. The cytokinins, plant hormones the seaweed produces in its own tissue, signal roots to branch, to multiply, to push into ground they would otherwise leave alone. The plant is not just fed, it is told to grow. The gardener, who has lost a corner of the garden to soil that nothing seems to fix, can spend one autumn afternoon spreading marl and seaweed and watch that ground come back by spring. The Hebridean crofters, the Cornish coastal farmers, the Breton fishermen, the people who tilled with the sea, built soil that fed their grandchildren without ever buying anything. The modern alternative ships limestone 800 miles from a quarry in a 50-pound bag, then sells the trace minerals separately in foil packets at $15 an ounce. The seaweed still washes up on the shore for any gardener with a wheelbarrow and a free morning. The shore has not stopped giving. The world has stopped walking down to the shore. 5 recipes, 5 traditions, 5 ways of feeding the soil that altogether cost less than a single bag of synthetic fertilizer at the garden centre, and that altogether can hold a garden in production for as long as the gardener cares to tend it. 5 recipes: Terra preta from the Amazon, Sturcus from Rome, the closed circle of the Chinese paddy, the high-altitude blend of the Andes, the marl and seaweed of the Atlantic coast. Each one feeds the soil. Each one outlasts the gardener who applies it. Each one shows in the bed within one growing season. Fertility by the season is bought. Fertility by the century is built. The bag at the garden centre sells the first. The Amazonian and the Roman and the Chinese and the Andean and the Hebridean farmer built the second. The gardener who learns these 5 recipes will never again wait for the truck from the garden centre, will never again pour a stronger dose into exhausted ground, will never again mistake a bag of synthetic granules for the slow, patient, ancient work of soil building. And the tomato plant in the corner of the garden, the one with leaves curling brittle at the edges, the one in soil packed hard as fired clay, will push roots into ground that holds water 3 days longer, will set fruit into October, will feed a household next summer, and the summer after that, and every summer after. Which of the 5 recipes calls loudest to the corner of the garden the gardener has been losing? Leave it in the comments. Send this to the friend, the neighbour, the family member who is still pouring synthetic into a bed that will not respond. These 5 recipes belong to the gardener who understands that the soil their grandchildren will inherit is being built, or being burned, in the bed under their hands right now. Happy gardening.